Word of Mouth is an adult story time presented by the Juliette Hampton Morgan Memorial Library. My name is Amy Campbell, and today I'll be reading 33 Wicked Daughters by Kelly Barnhill. If you enjoy today's program, new stories are posted every second Sunday at 2:30 on YouTube and Facebook. As a reminder, some stories contain adult language and content. It is recommended you review stories before allowing younger audiences to listen. It started with whispers, and if it had remained so, then perhaps King Diodysius could have contented himself with doing nothing. One can, he reasoned, build a fine career on doing nothing as a matter of policy. Indeed, it was a strategy that had served the king well all these years. That his daughters were, by all accounts, uniformly wicked was not a thing of particular concern. After all, what was wickedness anyway? Wasn't it all a bit in the eye of the beholder? His daughters, despite the whispers, did not seem particularly wicked to him. Indeed, the king felt his daughters were, while numerous and chattering, and a whirlwind of arms and legs and hair and minds and endless plans, well, he thought they were rather marvelous, if he were to be truthful about it. Albina, for example, his dear Albina, the eldest of the 33, who was at this very minute constructing a wealth distribution scheme that would, within 10 years' time, permanently erase poverty in the nation, removing the mandated tithes and tariffs to the barony, and while she was at it, abolishing the baronry. That didn't sound particularly wicked now, did it? The king was uncomfortable with the barons anyway. They were, as a rule, an uncouth, bullying, brutish bunch. Perhaps it was better if they learned a trade. The barons disagreed. They lobbied to have Albina's documents burned and to have her banned from any official business. There was a vote, and it was unanimous. And the king supposed he should respect such a thing. But he loved it when Albina sat by his side during the presentations of his economists and financiers and policymakers, and he loved listening to her argue. And gosh darn it, he said to himself, didn't she just sound so reasonable? So he did nothing. Wicked, the barons said, and they began to seethe. And Arline, who made it her habit to show up unannounced at council meetings and invoke the wisdom of scholars and philosophers so numerous and obscure that by the time the honorable council members finished finding enough corresponding quotations to even hope to contradict her, she already had new decrees penned, royally signed and sealed, and had distributed each one to the relevant ministries, offices, and bureaucrats, which meant that they could never be undone without endless meetings and processes and forms signed in triplicate. Arline, better than anyone else in the kingdom, knew how government worked, and she worked it. And Anise, the cobbler, who produced shoes of such beauty, comfort, and efficiency that she single-handedly opened the market once scrupulously cornered by the Shoemakers Guild. Similarly, she managed through her own ingenious styling and construction to create footwear for women that increased their comfort, well-being, and mobility. And suddenly, in the streets, market squares, trade floors, and halls of business, women were everywhere. And they didn't seem eager to leave anytime soon. And to make it worse, she never bothered to license her designs with any of the guilds, and instead widely distributed her drawings and instructions so that literally anyone could make them on their own. Unlicensed shoes, how dare she? Wicked, grumbled the guild masters, and the futures traders, and the business peddlers. Wicked, wicked, wicked. And Andromeda, whose liturgical dances, all fluid movement and bare skin and ecstatic joy, caused temples full of worshippers to loosen their garments, shed their clothes, and begin dancing in delight and spiritual fervor for hours on end. It was said that even the universe sighed with pleasure. Nudity? The priests' union complained. So much nudity. Well, the king thought, readjusting the drape of his robes and wishing once again that he could shrug it off, if the clothiers would bother making their stitching less uncomfortable, maybe people wouldn't be so quick to undress. Wicked, the priests said. And Althea, his favorite, who was right now in the slums of the kingdom, teaching, reading, and writing and mathematics to the children of laborers, telling their parents such pretty phrases like, knowledge and education are both categorized as a means of production, and their productive capacity belongs to you and your children and to no one else, and I should like to see you capitalize upon it. Nothing pleased the king more than watching his daughter teach, and while he wasn't entirely sure what means of production meant, he simply loved hearing her say it. Wicked, the king thought? Surely not. And Alana, the tavern owner, do you have any idea what goes on in that tavern in the middle of the night? The council asked. The king didn't. He went to bed far too early. But how bad could it be? And Anika, the boxer, undefeated in any category, still booking agents put the odds against her every time, because how could they favor her to win? Against giants of men? And there she was, barely 100 pounds soaking wet, and yet she crushed them every time. It went against reason. She even bested soldiers who came to try their luck, well-trained and highly skilled all, who then had to face the wrath of their generals for being so foolish as to be bested by a girl so small. How was it possible? Wicked, the legion of gamblers said, and generals too. Wicked, wicked. And Aurora, and Anastasia, and Ada, and Abigail, and Adele, and Amara, and Alice. Wicked, 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 wicked. The daughters heard the whispers. Of course they did. They weren't stupid. And so they formed a council of their own and formed a plan. The antidote to rumors is action, they decided, and the counterbalance to grumbling is positive change. We'll build schools, Althea said, lots of them, all over. We have money, more money than we need. We'll put them everywhere. No one can argue with a school. We'll create a community bank, said Albina, and allocate an annual income for every man, woman, and child. Have you seen Father's treasury? No one needs that much. And anyway, it's just sitting there. Better to get that money moving. We'll distribute shoes to every child, said Anise. Winter is coming after all, and far too many kids walk barefoot. Community dinners, said Alana. We'll teach girls how to fight and defend themselves, said Anika. We'll dance without ceasing, said Andromeda. Each daughter proposed a plan to do good, to be good. Each daughter agreed that they must, as a group, insist upon being of service to the kingdom. That is what it meant to be a king's daughter. That is, while there are still kings, each one thought in the quietness of her heart. Because how could there be in the future? It just didn't make any sense. And without delay, the daughters put their plans into action. Schools popped up like mushrooms. The poorest in the land had money to spend. Bellies filled, tiny cold feet found protection and warmth in brand new shoes. Legions of girls learned how to throw a punch, and a spiritual revival swept across the land like a delicious breeze as people found the grace to express their devotion through song and dance, freed from the bounds of shame or tradition or convention. And they were beloved, the 33 wicked daughters, by the proletariat at least. The barons and the guild class and the bourgeoisie, along with their friends among the priests and council and generals, all were of another opinion. Peasants carved likenesses of the various daughters into the trunks of trees and the doorposts and lintels of houses. School children painted their faces on placards and stones. Poor families named their own daughters Althea and Alana and Anika and Anise, Andromeda, Aurora, Ada, and the rest. Villages venerated the daughters as saints. They carved statues and placed them in temples and market squares. Blushing brides laid bouquets of roses at the feet of the wicked daughters. Wicked, whispered the council. Wicked, murmured the generals and the guild masters. Wicked, grumbled the priests, mages, and clerics. Wicked, challenged the barons. Had it simply been whispers, then yes, the king could have done nothing. Grumbles too, but a challenge was another thing. And it was the challenge that kept the king up now. He paced his quarters all night long. He visited his pigeons asleep in the aviary and asked their advice. The pigeons, of course, said nothing and instead blinked back from the shadows of their lofts, their eyes bright and hard and keening. He loved his daughters. Of course he did. He didn't always remember their names and couldn't always tell them apart, but he loved them anyway, with their pronounced chins and their broad shoulders and their quick feet. He loved how they wrestled and built and climbed as children, how they would go from creatures of beauty and delicacy and ribbons and grace one moment to a horde of screeching, scratching, scheming harridans the next. He loved their loud voices and their strong muscles and their wildness. He loved how they could outthink, out-reason, and out-argue him at dinner. He loved the depths of their knowledge and the beauty of their faces and the bawdiness of their jokes. He found their inexplicable incongruencies utterly delightful. But this challenge, it was tricky. The crown on his head was a necessary burden, but it wasn't pleasant. Still, it wasn't as though he could simply retire. Kings are kings until they are not, and they leave their offices either aged and decrepit in sick rooms or with their heads paraded through market squares and hoisted upon a bloody spike. What would become of his daughters then? Would the council protect them? Would the generals or the priests? The king didn't know, and he certainly didn't know where he could turn. The next morning, he called his daughters into the royal receiving room. When they arrived, the king felt his breath catch. How beautiful they all were, and yet he could see by the darkness under their eyes and the thinness of their bodies that they were all working themselves far too hard. Was it wickedness that was causing this exhaustion? Was it possible that the barons and the priests and the council were correct? The king decided to ask. He cleared his throat. Girls, he said. Yes, father, his 33 daughters replied. Are you... His voice trailed off. This wasn't an easy discussion. He tried again. Are any of you or all of you, as the case may be, which is to say, I don't want to presume or assume. Still, as I was saying, you have probably noticed, unless you haven't, which is also perfectly fine, but still, girls, I must ask, in case it is true, even though I cannot imagine that it is, you know your father loves you and will continue to do so no matter what, without ceasing and without question. So, what was my question? Oh, yes, very good, my question. He stopped and looked at his daughters, an expression of painful desperation on his face. Finally, Albina, the eldest, went to her father and took his hands. Her fingers, he noticed, were covered with paper cuts, and she had no fewer than 15 quills stuck at random in the coiled braids snaking around her skull. Father, she said, you look worried. The king sighed in relief. She understood. Of course she did. Oh, Albina, I am terribly worried. There is so much whispering throughout the kingdom. People think you're wicked, as if you could be wicked. You! And not just you, darling, all of you together. And it's crazy, of course. You're not wicked at all. He paused and bit his lip. He glanced sidelong at the marvelous young women assembled in front of him. He loved them so much he thought he'd burst. Unless, that is to say, not that I would judge, but are you wicked, All 33 daughters rolled their eyes. No, father, they said in unison. For crying out loud, they muttered as one. Oh, good, the king said. I knew it. He pressed his hands to his heart, as though desperately trying to keep it inside his chest. Oh, my dearest daughters, come give your papa a hug. And one by one, the daughters hugged their father, and as they did so, they caught one another's eye and exchanged a grim expression. This isn't going away, their eyes told one another, and it is probably going to get worse. The next day, Ada the archer was out in the green fields shooting at painted targets when one of the council members arrived with a phalanx of soldiers accusing her of slaughtering one of the nation's sacred hawks. He displayed the hawk for all to see with one of Ada's arrows shot through its heart. The punishment for the murder of a sacred hawk was death of course, to be rendered immediately, as was the law, and that was exactly what would have come to pass if not for a group of moss-gatherers who happened to be in the field that day, who witnessed not only that Ada hit nothing but targets with her arrows, but also the council member who scurried behind a target, plucked out an arrow, and plunged it into the heart of an already dead hawk. "Look," the moss-gatherers said, "there's no blood, and the bird's neck is wrung, and look at its eyes, so dull. The poor thing's been dead for at least a day." These were incontrovertible facts. The phalanx of soldiers turned their gaze to the council member. Well, he stammered. His voice trailed off, and he said no more. A soldier's sword neatly removed the council member's head from his wrinkled neck. The law is the law, after all, and really, he should be grateful. The removal of the head is quick and kind. Had his offense been worse, he might have been sent to the island of the giants to be devoured. There is no worse fate than that. A week after that, Abigail, the knife maker, found herself accused of murder. 3 of her knives had been found in the backs of peasants, murdered in the darkest of dark alleys. 3 of the barons hauled her in front of the king, who wept at the wickedness of it. Abigail kept her composure. "Father," she said, "ask for the knives in question to be brought forth." He did, and they were. "Now ask one of your soldiers to unwrap the leather binding on the handles." "This is nonsense," the barons protested. "Surely she is only trying to buy time." Abigail remained unflustered. She looked at her father. "As you know, Father, when I first learned the skills of knife making, I fashioned beautiful knives for each of your barons, just like these. What you may not know is that I also inscribed the names of each knife's owner on the handle under the leather bindings for exactly this purpose." "I mean to say," the barons shouted. But there, etched in metal, were their names: Baron Ferris, Baron Skulkin, and Baron Malaire. With a heavy sigh, the king asked his soldiers to haul them to the dungeons. They pleaded for mercy. The king scoffed. "Feel lucky I did not have you sent to the giants." But this was an empty threat, and he knew it. While this was the legally justified punishment for the worst offenders, the king had never used it. He had read what happens to people there, and it turned his stomach. "Thank you, Father," Abigail said, kissing his cheek. She turned and walked out of the castle. She had knives to make, after all. The king shook his head. "This is a dangerous game you girls are playing," he said, as she retreated, but he wasn't sure if she heard him. Sometimes fathers lock their daughters at the tops of high towers, the king thought desperately, or build high walls around abbeys and insist that their daughters become nuns or marry them off. But the king couldn't bear to do any of those things. He'd missed them too much. Besides, he had no idea how he'd find a way to do it. They were tough, his daughters, and wily, and they were much, much smarter than he. He had known that for years. The accusations didn't stop, and then came the attacks. Anika the boxer lost the first match of her life, owing to the fact that a man reached around the edge of the ring and grabbed her arms, allowing her opponent to wail upon her face again and again until she saw stars. The crowd roared and complained, but the referee did nothing. Everyone could see the bulge of coins rattling in his pocket. Alana's tavern burned down in the middle of the night. Althea's favorite school was suddenly infested with rats. Arlene was accused of sedition. Albina was accused of theft. Andromeda's women's prayer circle was suddenly attacked by misguided young men, convinced by the barons that a joyful circle of dancing naked women was somehow an assault on the delicate and fragile flower of the masculinity of men everywhere, their own mostly, and was possibly the reason why they had neither jobs nor girlfriends, and that it was likely all a sinister plot, doubtlessly hatched by their mothers. They attacked with rocks and clubs and ugly words. Fortunately, the members of the prayer circle were also members of Anika's self-defense workshops, and all of them knew how to throw a punch and land a kick, and all of them were quite good at it. The young men retreated, and then they threatened to sue. The 33 daughters ended each day tired and sore, bruised and broken-hearted. They did their best to hide this from their father. At night they kissed his cheeks and squeezed his hands and retired to their quarters, sleeping like the dead. The barons had counted on this. With the entire castle worn to the point of exhaustion, it didn't take much to tip the whole place into a slumbering stupor. A bit of poppy tincture in the wine, henbane powdered on the handkerchiefs, ground up mandrake thrown on the fire, causing billows of sleeping smoke to curl around the castle. Everyone would be unconscious for hours. 33 barons snuck into 33 bedrooms and carried off 33 unconscious daughters, each bringing one daughter to his own castle, to a hidden secret room within, a bridal boudoir, if you will, with no windows and no skylights, a heavy iron door at the threshold, and a very strong lock. 33 priests arrived before dawn, one at the home of each baron, to mumble the wedding rites over the heads of the sleeping daughters and to sign the documents binding each one irrevocably in marriage to each scheming baron. The plan, they reasoned, was foolproof. They locked their new wives into the prison boudoirs and prepared to present themselves, not as barons any longer, but sons. Married, the king said over his morning bowl of porridge. He had a screaming headache, and his thoughts were labored and slow, and not a single one of his daughters had come downstairs to kiss him good morning, which had never happened before. It put the king in a foul, confounded mood. Happily so, said Baron Year, with a florid bow. How happy we are to be part of your family, dear father-in-law. I mean, Dad. Let's just stick with my king for now, the king said with a frown. There was something about this situation that didn't sit right, but his head hurt and his thinking slogged, and he couldn't for the life of him ascertain exactly what. One of the barons called for champagne, and another called for strawberries, and another called for cake, and still another called for a bit of beef and perhaps some pickled onions, and maybe a few loaves of bread, since one does get peckish after one's wedding night, doesn't one? And the sons-in-laws ate and drank and sang and guffawed, and all the while the king kept glancing at the door, waiting for his daughters to burst in like a whirlwind, or a cleansing fire, or a mighty wave. But they didn't come. The barons left with bawdy jokes and burly man hugs and promises of grandsons. They pounded the king's back and told him to get used to being called grandpop. The king hadn't even considered grandsons, or any sort of grandchildren. He just wanted to talk to his daughters. Days passed, weeks, a month. The king couldn't bear it. Please, he said to his sons-in-law, send my daughters. I miss them. Tell them to come around for tea or dinner. Surely you can spare them for one night. Their beds are made here and their rooms are ready. I check each one each day to make sure it was exactly how they like it. This was true. When they were home, his daughters swirled and tangled in his mind, and he rarely could keep them straight. But now that they were gone, his broken heart separated and elevated each one. He remembered things he did not even know that he knew. How many blankets each girl preferred, how they liked their breakfasts, what they liked to read, whether they kept their rooms cool or roasting, the sorts of scents they liked on their pillows. He realized, an encyclopedia of daughter knowledge. Please, he said again, tell them to visit their old dad. I yearn for them. No, the barons said jovially. They winked and chortled. They were, the king felt, his cheeks growing hot, unnecessarily rakish. And deep within him, a fire started to burn. Why ever not? His voice was even and sharp like a blade. Our wives are too busy. Wives cleave to their husbands, you know. It's in the contract. They belong to their husbands now. This is how it works. What are they busy with? The king asked. The barons hesitated. Wife things, they said at last, and various wifely activities. I see, the king said. The fire in his belly grew hotter. He closed his eyes. He needed to think. He needed his daughters. He was lost without them. He told his barons that his strength was not what it once was, and that he needed to take a lie down. The barons saw this as a hopeful sign. "This is our time," they told one another, "ours." And they started scheming, each man for himself, as to the best way to capitalize on the situation. They imagined the king's dear head raised upon a pike in the market square. They made sure to whisper their hopes and dreams to their brand new wives, and listen to them pound upon the locked doors of their secret rooms, screaming all the while. It was the screaming, they decided, that satisfied the soul. They imagined their new wives coming around after a bit, eventually. The marriages, after all, had not yet been consummated, given that the barons relied on the locked iron doors to prevent their wives from ripping out their throats. Still, eventually, they would accept. Surely they would, maybe even love them. It was destiny. A king needed a clever queen, after all. And each baron truly believed in the deepest part of his heart that he would be king, even if he had to slaughter each of his comrades to make it happen. Meanwhile, the schools closed. The shoes were gathered and burned. The community banks emptied their coffers. The barons collaborated with the council to make punching illegal for girls, punishable by time in the stocks. Also illegal for girls, learning and libraries, and any sort of banking or political science or tavern ownership. And they encouraged the priests to crack down on prayer circles. They created forums for young men to vent their concerns about reluctant maidens and mean ladies, and how very difficult it was to be a young man these days. And as they voiced their petulance, they became more and more petulant. And as they cataloged their aggrievements, they became more and more aggrieved. Disdain curled into the faces of the populace and hardened like plaster. The king called the priests, asking for details about the weddings. "Why was I not invited?" the king demanded. "Perhaps you weren't as close to your daughters as you thought," the priests replied primly. That can't be true, the king thought. Can it? He took a different tack. "Show me the contracts from the wedding night." The priests complied and showed him the documents, all smudged and hastily done. The barons had signed floridly. The daughters' signatures were simply an inky smush. "Were they even conscious?" the king asked. "Would it matter?" the priest said. "Obviously it matters," the king said. "Then, yes," they kept their eyes on the ground. They gave their word, and the word of a priest mattered, in theory. The king dismissed them. He called in the generals. "What recourse do I have?" he asked. "None, my king," the general said. "None under the law." He turned to the council. "Is this true?" "Quite true, my king," the council members said. The council and the generals exchanged sly glances. The king took note and dismissed them. He went to the guildmasters, but they were no help. He turned to the bureaucrats, but they were useless. The proletariat could have assisted him, and would have gladly, but the laws were ancient and inflexible, and peasants had no legal standing. "This system is stupid," the king told his pigeons as he paced the aviary. "I should have listened to Albina and had the laws changed. I should have tasked Arlene to write up the bills and force them through the council. I should have done something. This is my fault." The pigeons hopped out of their lofts and nestled on his shoulders and arms. They perched on his head and clung to his beard and long cloak. They had always been a comfort to him, and were even more so now. He remembered how much his daughters loved the pigeons when they were small. And then he looked outside and saw children in the marketplace begging for coins and scraps. Children who were, just a few months earlier, learning and working in school where they belonged, the king realized. Althea was right. Of course she was. Althea was always right. "My darlings," he said to his pigeons, "I think I have a plan." The pigeons cooed, clearly approving. The king went to the window and brought a stack of paper with him. He wrote something on 33 pieces of paper, then folded each one into the shape of a star. Most monarchs in those days kept pigeons. It was a thing kings did. Unlike other monarchs, though, the king was extraordinarily good at training his pigeons. Indeed, it was the thing he was best at. They were, to a bird, marvels of grace and intelligence. He gave a high whistle, and the birds stood at attention. "Well done, my lads and lasses," he said. He indicated the paper stars. "Please, take these papers to those children down there. I need their help." The birds required no other orders. They understood him perfectly. The king watched with delight as each bird grabbed a star in its beak and flew in great spirals from the windows to the square. He hoped that Althea had done her job well and taught those children how to read. Down below, the children in the market square, empty-bellied and frightened, watched as birds poured out of the sky. One pigeon landed in front of each child and timidly hopped close. The children stared at the folded stars, and their eyes welled up as they remembered their teacher, Althea, instructing them how to fold paper stars exactly like that. How they missed her. How they wished she hadn't gotten married. How they wished she hadn't abandoned them. The birds dropped the stars into the children's outstretched hands before returning to the air. This is what the papers said. "My daughters are trapped, including your teacher. I cannot get them on my own. I need your help. I have lots of food. Come and eat. Also, I am lots of fun and children love me." Normally, the children knew not to trust people who said that last bit, but then they gazed up and saw the king, and they noticed how lonely he looked, and how sad. And he was their teacher's father, after all. From the high window, he gave a timid wave, and the children waved back. They looked at one another and shrugged, and by doing so, came to an agreement. And so the children, all 33 of them, marched to the castle and were ushered inside. Not long after, Albina, in the darkened dimness of her locked boudoir, heard a scratching at the door, and then she heard the heavy bolt squeak and slide back, and then she saw a small face at the crack. "Hello, teacher sister," the child said, her face splitting wide into a broad grin. "Why, hello," Albina said, peering behind the child to see if she had come alone. The hallway was empty. Was this a trap? It didn't appear so. "Who has sent you, child?" "Your father," the child said. "He invited us into the castle, and then he brought in a bunch of thieves to teach us how to be thieves, so we might sneak in and steal you away. I did not need to learn how to be a thief because I already am one, and I'm good too." The child grinned. The guards outside didn't know what hit them. "Well done, child," Albina said. "Thank you," the girl said. "Your father sent me to fetch you because he wants to know what the plan should be." "I see," Albina said. She was, if truth be spoken, extremely good at making plans, and her father, bless him, was not. She closed her eyes and took stock of the situation. "So you are the only one breaking into our prisons. No one else is seeing my sisters tonight, is that right?" "Yes, teacher sister. I'm the only one right now who can do this." Albina nodded. "Good girl. Well, it does not make sense for you to break me out right now, as much as I hate it here. It would put my sisters in too much danger." The girl's eyes widened suddenly, and she rested her hand on Albina's arm. "Someone's coming, miss. I need to sneak away, and right quick." "Then I will make this fast. There are 2 plans. One that you and your friends must communicate to my sisters, and one that you must tell my father. He may know his, but not the other. My sisters must know both. Can you do this?" "I can do that and more, miss," the girl said. "Marvelous." And she whispered the plans as quickly as she could, and the girl slipped out, bolted the door, and vanished without a trace. Another month went by, and the king sent invitations to all his sons-in-laws to gather in the great hall. He laid out a feast with wine and meat and complicated breads and all kinds of delicacies and gastronomical wonders. The barons ate and drank and toasted one another's cleverness. They complimented the king. They boasted their accomplishments. Each baron calculated his odds at a coup, which barons would support him, which barons would oppose him, and which would fall. Each thought himself already king of the wide world, standing on the shoulders of these imbeciles and good-for-nothings assembled at the table. They thought of the daughters, wives now, but in name only, as those doors remained locked. But maybe, they thought, in time, those daughters had skills, after all, and complex minds. Surely they could be convinced to share a throne and maybe, eventually, a bed, if the knives were hidden. The barons took another glug of wine and returned their attentions to the manly banter at the table. They were all honeyed tones and creamy praise and velveted claws. "It's a glorious day to be alive," Baron Edel toasted. "In the most glorious kingdom in the world," offered Baron Slavin. "To our land," shouted Baron Year, his glass raised as high as it could go. "To the king," added Baron Egot. "And to our most beautiful wives," toasted Baron Gloat. A chill fell upon the room. The other barons glared at Gloat. "Speaking of," the king said. And so it was, by decree of the king, that a ball was to be held for all the new sons-in-law and their blushing brides. All were required to attend. Any who did not would be cut off from their inheritances and tithing capabilities and would be cast out of their castles by order and fiat. Long live the king! The decree was irrevocable. And the new sons-in-law would wear new coats sewn by hand at the castle as a gift from the king, the most beautiful coats ever to be seen in all the land, with spun gold and silver threads, pearl buttons running down the front, and tiny diamonds gleaming in the stitching. Thus spake the king. And the king's daughters would wear new gowns sewn by hand at the castle as a gift from their father, the most beautiful gowns ever to be seen in all the land, with spun gold and silver threads, pearl buttons running down their long backs, and tiny diamonds gleaming in the stitching. The daughters would wear nothing else. Thus spake the king. The date was set. They had 2 months. The barons began to panic. "A plan," they whispered. "A plan. We must have a plan. We must be a united front." But how could they be? With this band of scoundrels? Instinctively, each man brought his hand to his neck as though warding away the executioner's axe. So distracted were the barons as they whispered and schemed, as they met in secret quorums and darkened alleys, that they did not notice that there were more children moving about than usual. And they did not notice that the children were wearing dark clothing and black hoods, and that they were unusually good at bounding over large objects or climbing walls. They did not notice that the children had light feet and quiet steps and sticky fingers. Nor did they notice the strange proliferation of pigeons. Coins went missing, and keys, letter openers, and letters. But the barons didn't notice. They sweated and worried. They lived on the border of panic. That the king was a rube and an idiot and easily dispensed with, well, everyone knew that. But this ball, and with the daughters, it required an airtight plan and a consistent conspiracy with an agreed-upon flowchart of actions and reactions, scripts and responses. It required, at its heart, a substantial amount of trust. But did Baron Year trust Baron Lassus? Did Baron Egot truly rely on Baron Avarice? Was it possible to build a band of brothers when each one imagined himself as eventual king and did not mind so much if the rest of them hanged? It was, each baron knew in his heart, rather doubtful. Having no one to trust, each baron knelt by his imprisoned wife's door. The screaming had stopped, after all. The reluctant wives had become, in each household, quiet, introspective, circumspect. They were excellent listeners, good at analysis and helpful. Perhaps, each baron thought, she is coming around, and each one imagined himself at the center of the palace with a canny and lovely wife resting her hand on his. "If you betray me," the barons whispered to the locked doors, "I shall cut your throat." "Of course you will," the daughters soothed. "I'm sure that's how the story goes. Now, tell me your troubles." and the daughters listened. Meanwhile, other things went missing: tall boots, jaunty scarves, toupee glue and scissors, leather breeches and bracings, here and there, house after house. But the barons were beside themselves with worry and did not notice. The ball, after all, was only a month away, and then a fortnight, and then a week, and then a day. The gowns arrived, and masks, beautiful masks, birds for the daughters, beasts for the barons, and the coats, of course, were things of beauty and perfectly rendered. The barons tried them on, feeling proud and sick. There was a plan among the barons, of course there was. It was discussed ad nauseum. But would it be followed? Would they be safe? And how could each one know? I shall need my ladies-in-waiting to come to see to my toilette, the daughters told their husbands through the locked doors. How else can I show my face in my father's court? How else can you show off your beautiful gem of a wife unless she is able to beautify before the ball? The barons, each in his own castle, shook their heads. Out of the question, they sputtered. How can I trust your ladies in waiting? How can I know they won't go scurrying off to your father and tell him everything? They wouldn't, the wives soothed. I'd tell them not to. But they wouldn't know the whole story, the barons whined. Their narrative would lack context. They would jump to conclusions. Well, the daughters said after a long practiced deliberation, it's not like it's difficult. It's just hair and makeup and a bath, help with my dress. A child could do it. Surely you have seen a lot of unaccompanied children lately, just loitering about. What with the schools closed? It's good to give them a test, keeps them out of mischief. As fortune would have it, there was a child just loitering about. What luck! A child in a dark cloak, and good heavens, the poor thing was covered in pigeons. The kingdom had clearly fallen into a dreadful state. The barons felt themselves puff up with their own cleverness and big-heartedness and civic responsibility. Look at me, they told themselves, solving problems like a boss. It's as if I'm already king. Each baron ran outside and addressed the child. You look like a lost soul in need of a purpose, the baron said with magnanimity. Come, I have a job for you. Thank you, sir, the child said with an implacable expression in those young, wide eyes. Whatever would I have done without you? The ball began with candles and wine and music. Beads made of cut glass had been strung on interlocking threads, forming glittering patterns over the revelers' heads. How lovely, the guests remarked, complimenting the king. It is ever so like a spider's web. Isn't it just, said the king, avoiding their eyes. But which are we, the guests joked, spiders or flies? Which indeed, the king replied, and then he excused himself to have a bit more water. He missed his daughters. He missed them so much. He was beside himself. He counted the moments until they were scheduled to appear. There must be beads, the young thief told the king after she had visited Albina all those nights ago. How many beads? The king asked. Thousands, the child said. They must be strung on great interlocking threads and hung overhead like a glittering spider's web in the morning. But why? The king asked. The child would not say. The music played, the wine flowed, exquisitely dressed men and women snaked through the guests, offering all manner of culinary delights. The servers wore masks. The guests wore masks. Dancers moved with joy and abandon, and guests politely applauded their efforts. No one noticed the children, gathering like shadows in the corners, congregating behind the drapes, sliding between the swaying trunks of a forest of adults. No one noticed the pigeons perched on the children's shoulders, cooing and whispering without ceasing. Sometimes a ring found itself liberated from a bloated finger, or a purse wandered away from a carelessly fastened belt. No one noticed. Wine flowed. Delicacies floated past on great trays. Minutes ticked by. An hour, nearly 2. Finally, the coaches bearing the barons and the daughters streamed in through the gates. The barons stepped out of the carriages. They each wore tall boots, leather breeches, and matching marvelous coats. Their mustaches were coiffed and curled. They wore beaded masks over their eyes. They were all manner of beasts. The barons found this delightful, so forceful, so masculine. They stood for a moment in front of the coaches, hailed the other barons as an invitation to notice how fine each one looked, and then turned and offered their hands to the daughters. Each daughter emerged in a flounce of spangles and beads. They wore masks over their faces, all manner of birds. Each daughter had tied up her hair into a complicated tower of braids and ribbons and flowers. Hire wig makers, the child had told the king, repeating the instructions that Albina had made her hastily memorize. Have the wig makers teach the children to master their art. The king listened and wrinkled his brow. But why? He asked. The girl made her eyes as blank as saucers. I cannot know, my king, she lied. Immediately after their announcement, the gathered guests, the daughters, and the barons began to dance. The cloaked children moved more quickly through the crowd, while the pigeons opened their wings and fluttered up to the strung beads overhead. Dance, the children whispered to the guests. Dance and dance and dance. The guests could not tell who had spoken, only that the music played, only that the urge for dancing shook their bones and rhythm rattled their feet, only that the daughters and the barons were a delight of color and glitter and light. Skirts began to swirl, heels clicked on the polished floor, ribbons and sashes fluttered and snapped like flags. The daughters raised their long arms. They spun toward their baron husbands, who nearly cried out in astonishment and joy at this unexpected gesture of affection and theater. Did anyone notice under the daughters' spinning skirts the masculine strut of leather breeches and bracings? Did anyone notice the riding boots? Perhaps not. The dance had begun, after all. The barons clapped their hands. The music swelled. They swirled and clicked and stamped. The dance became wild, feral. They were wolves. They were swans. They were wild horses thundering from hillside to hillside. They were unkind ravens and murderous crows. The music wailed. The children reached for the ribbons trailing from the coats and gowns of the spinning barons and the daughters. They pulled. And as they pulled, the pigeons bit the webbed threads hanging overhead, sending a rush of bright beads cascading down to the ground. The guests covered their eyes. They rolled on the beads. The dresses fluttered open like great wide wings. There were wings everywhere. Wings, wings, wings. And in a great chaotic crowd, they fell to the ground. Dresses for the daughters and coats for the barons, the child told the king. That's what you must make, and they must be beautiful. I don't want to give those imbeciles a darn thing, the king harumphed. Coats, bah! They can have their hair shirts and prison jumpers. It must be coats for the barons and gowns for your daughters, special coats and particular gowns. Obviously, my daughters shall have whatever they wish. How pretty should the dresses be? The child shook her head. She explained slowly and carefully. The design of the coat does not matter, whatever looks stylish, but the design of the dress does matter. You must go to Alana's crafting workshop and use the design that is on the desk right now. She calls it the transformation dress. It's the one with the ribbons. It ties together and opens up like wings. I shall contact the guild at once. No, the child said, not the guild. You must hire seamstresses from the villages. They have magic hands. Send your secret guards to each village and ask for the most extraordinary seamstress. Tell them they cannot know what it is for. They will guess and send accordingly. The king was unsatisfied. The child pressed her lips together in a thin, tight line. Can I at least make the coats uncomfortable? The king pressed. They won't be wearing them for long, the child assured him, though she refused to explain further. Later, this is what the guests remembered. Indeed, it was the only story that anyone told for months after, in the gossip papers, in the taverns, over tea, in all the best circles. The families of the guilds and the generals and the priests and the council, they could talk of nothing else. Such a scandal! Who could have known how very, very wicked those daughters had been? For all that time, the poor king, the poor, poor man. The beads came down. Everyone fell. The music continued. Birds flew in people's faces. The cloaks seemed to fall from the sky. There was chaos. The candles went out, and there was a scream, and then another, and another. "Knives!" someone yelled. Who was it? One of the barons, surely. "They have knives! Help! Help! I am cut! I am slain!" The candles burned again, all at once, though no one could tell who had lit them. The guests pulled themselves to their feet and realized something astonishing. The barons stood in a circle, swords out, staring levelly at their wives. The daughters, all 33 of them, were kneeling on the ground. Their hands were bound behind their backs, their faces squinched beneath their masks, as though trying to remove them with their cheek muscles. The towers of the hair leaned this way and that. Their dresses fit them ill. But didn't everyone always say that they were a bit uncouth in their bearing? A little too masculine, a little too hairy, and they were wearing riding boots? So unfashionable. They struggled, but their bonds held firm. The barons, on the other hand, were so lithe and handsome in their coats. Their masks showed all manner of beasts, and what beautiful beasts! So brave and noble they were, so delicately boned, and bleeding, the poor things. Each one with a slice to their neck. They held handkerchiefs to their skin to stop the flow. They had married those daughters as an antidote to their wickedness, and this was how the barons were to be repaid? A slice to the throat. Shocking! Thank the gods that those 33 wicked daughters missed their poor husbands' arteries. Thank the gods that all of those wounds were superficial. What was it that people said about women bleeding? Or perhaps they realized in the end that they lacked the stomach for true violence. This was the violence of ladies, underdone. The handsome barons were right. Of course they were. Even marriage could not save the 33 wicked daughters from their own wickedness. "My own daughters," the king said, his gaze flicking between the barons and their wives. "That it has come to this." He closed his eyes for a moment as though reaching a decision, though everyone knew what he was about to say. "To the giants," the king bellowed. "They shall be sent to the giants." The decree was irrevocable. Long live the king. The king ordered a boat to be brought to the harbor and commanded his daughters to board. It broke his heart, poor thing. But what choice did he have? And he such a tender man. How many times had this punishment been applicable? But he chose mercy instead. Many. Poor lamb. He did not permit them to speak, though they tried. They struggled in vain. They could not remove the gags from their mouths, nor the ropes from their hands and feet. They tried to yell, so deep their voices were. This is what happens when you let daughters run wild. They get mannish. I mean, the proof is right there. "Silence!" the king roared. He asked his beloved sons-in-law to usher those wicked girls onto the boat and to force it into the tide. "To sea with you, all to the sea." The boat found its way to the current, and the current pulled it out of the harbor. By mid-morning, they were gone. No one knew how long it took the sea to deliver cargo to the land of the giants. A day? A week? Did it matter? Good riddance, everyone agreed. And then, because the barons loved their dear old dad so very much, they abandoned their castles and even forewent their weekly tithing and tax collection, and instead moved into the palace. Such good boys. Everyone said so. And what's more, it seemed that the king and his former sons-in-law, now sons, had opened their hearts and homes to the unfamilied children who had been, until now, wandering the streets of the city with nowhere to go. Such humanitarians, those barons. The castle rang with children's voices. It was, everyone agreed, the happiest of places. And then the barons donated their wealth to the sovereign fund. So generous. And then they reinstated the prayer groups. setting an unknown veiled woman to keep them going. This, everyone decided, was a good thing, prayers and all. And the schools reopened. One of the barons instated himself as the teacher. Which one was it? Hard to know. They all blend together. The one with the beautiful face and the long neck, no facial hair. They all look so similar. Did they always? And suddenly the children had shoes, all of them. The barons took no credit, but everyone knew it was them. And one of them reorganized the court system, which was good, so unfair before. Too many bribes. Which baron was it? One of the good ones, one supposes. Sometimes, now, the king walks from the castle to the quay and stands at the edge of the water, looking out toward the horizon to the exact place where the boat carrying his daughters disappeared. Perhaps he misses them and wishes they would return. Perhaps he worries that they could come back and bring their wickedness with them. The king is accompanied, as he usually is these days, by his flocks of pigeons. Each time the pigeons spiral higher and higher and higher before returning to alighting on his shoulders, arms, or cloak. He whispers to his birds, who whisper back, and then he walks home, a jumble of feathers and wings and beaks and bright black eyes. He is more pigeon than man these days, poor thing, and walking slower every day. It's probably only a matter of time. Everyone says so. Well, he had a good run. 3 months after the ball, the king woke with a start. Something is different, he said to no one in particular, save the pigeons. There were always pigeons. Time was he kept his birds in their aviary at night, and he visited them at proper training intervals. But since the castle became overrun with children, the pigeons now were everywhere. No one could say for sure who was opening the cages, a child, or several children, or all of them, or the pigeons themselves. But now the pigeons had become used to freedom and would not go back. They loved the children and couldn't bear to be parted from them. And they loved the king too. Most nights he slept under a blanket of pigeons, all cooing in their sleep. The king had never slept so well in his life. Something is different, he said again. Whoo, said the pigeons. And then they flew off to find some children to play with. The king went down to breakfast. His daughters were there, in disguise, of course. Albina and Althea and Adeline and Aurora and Anika and who knows who else. He hardly recognized them, with their shorn heads and their heavy boots and their practiced mannish swagger. They shoved rolled socks in their trousers and taught themselves to spread and snort and slap and own. They farted constantly, which the king reasoned is fine, it's just... He missed his daughters, as they were, wickedness and all. Not actually wickedness, obviously, but he realized he missed the way they raised eyebrows. He missed the way they annoyed the council and the priests and the barons. He missed the smell of their hair and the swish of their skirts and the way their laughter sounded like music. Also, he could no longer tell them apart. Granted, he couldn't before, but now it was worse. They were uniformed now. Their hair was the same, and their clothes and their mannerisms. They were pantomiming barrenness, and doing so identically. He lived now in a household of actors, and each of them was playing the same character. Only the children helped to break the monotony. Thank goodness for that, the king thought. Breakfast was served as the children streaked through the room, climbing the drapes and hanging from the statues and sliding under the table. Mind you don't hurt yourselves, the king murmured for the millionth time as he thoughtfully munched on his toast. He looked at his daughters, or his sons-in-law, or his daughters who were pretending to be his sons who were pretending to be his daughters. His head hurt. This was confusing. He began. The daughters looked at their father. Their faces softened. They looked like themselves again. Althea? He said weakly. He wasn't sure if she was even at the table. He winced. Yes, father, said the most Althea-looking of all the sort of barons in the room. The king nearly sighed in relief. Has anyone checked the harbor this morning? The king asked. Has anyone looked for boats on the horizon? It's not coming back, father, the baron daughter closest to him said. gently reaching over and rubbing his back. Anika, he thought. She definitely sounded like Anika. She had swollen knuckles. That was Anika, right? Something's different today, the king muttered. Something is coming. I can feel it. The daughters exchanged stricken glances, but said nothing. "Hurr," said the pigeons, and the king became convinced that the pigeons agreed with him. Later that morning, the king returned to the water. He saw nothing. In the afternoon, he returned again, and again he saw nothing. But that evening, as the sun sank in the west, the king yet again returned to the harbor's edge, and there, at the rim of the sky, was a smudge. And as he stood and watched, the smudge became a splotch, and then the splotch became a shape, and the shape grew closer and closer until it looked like a boat. "Fly," he shouted to his pigeons. "Fly now, get my daughters, get the children, we must make a plan." And to his mariners he said this: "Take your fastest boats and your most skilled sailors, surround that vessel, bring it in quietly, and under the cover of darkness bring its occupants to the throne room without violence or incident. Bind them if you need to. If they fight, sink the ship and leave its sailors to drown." The mariners clicked their heels and bowed low to their king. As it turned out, the ship did not carry barons, nor soldiers, nor mercenaries of any kind. There were only 3 occupants aboard, and they were all giants. Or, more specifically, 2 giants and 1 giantess. They were, if everyone was being honest with themselves, much smaller than they would have imagined. No one had been to the land of giants for at least 4 generations. In the stories, its inhabitants were the size of houses. In actuality, their heads hovered near the ceiling, but did not touch it. The daughters joined their father in the receiving room and kept close. They eyed the giants warily. The giants did not appear to notice. They bowed low. They were impeccably polite. "My name is Runt," the tallest one said, "son of Grunt, son of Brunt." The daughter barons bowed in return. The giant Runt continued, gesturing to his companions, "And this is Og, son of Gog, son of Tog. And this is Marlene. We are emissaries, and we speak with the authority of the collective, as we have no monarch. We seek the 33 wicked daughters of King Diodysius. I have a message that can be read only to them." The daughter barons looked at one another. Albina cleared her throat, but the king raised his hand to stop her. "I'm afraid you are too late. The daughters of Diodesius, after being legally and modestly married to 33 dutiful barons, succumbed to their own wickedness. They attempted to cut their husbands' throats in order to return to their wicked ways. I placed them on a boat and sent them to sea. No one will ever hear from them again." "Your story is incorrect," the giant Og countered. "The marriages you mentioned were neither modest nor lawful, and while it is true that a boat full of gowned individuals left this harbor, they were nobody's daughters." Albina stepped forward. She jutted out her chin and narrowed her eyes. "You have only told us part of your story," she said. The giant Marlene bowed low once again. "And you, madam, have told me none of yours." The children had not been invited to the meeting. This, they decided, was utterly unfair, and they determined to do something to rectify the situation. Because they had become skilled in the arts of stealth and subterfuge and thievery, they had already made plans for just such a scenario. They knew the safe places to shimmy up behind the drapes. They knew how to scramble through the rafters. They knew how to drop down from the roof. They knew the secret passageways and forgotten gaps. They knew the castle better than they knew their own breath. And so they scurried in a silent creeping swarm and listened to the giant's story. This is how they learned that a ship full of sniveling, weeping barons landed on the shores of the land of giants. They learned how the barons, in their pleading for their miserable lives, had told the giants about the daughters of Diodesius, and how they wept at the wickedness of their wanton once-wives. They told the giants about the glittering coats and the sinister gowns that trapped them. They told the giants about the beads and the masks and the children in cloaks. They told the giants about the prison boudoirs and the perfectly implemented scheme, how they carried each sleeping daughter off in the night, how they tricked the king and then were tricked by the king and those wicked daughters. They told the giants about the community banks and the schools and the boxing matches and the knives and the nude dancing and the shoes, and how they had tried and tried and tried and tried to thwart those wretched daughters, and how they thought they had finally found a way, until they didn't. So, what you are saying is that you poisoned, kidnapped, lied, plotted regicide, and schemed, and are now upset that others schemed against you, the giant asked the barons. Well, actually, sniffed the barons, but the giants did not let them finish. They couldn't stand it for another second. They ate them on the spot. They tasted, the giants now explained, awful, and gave the entire nation a terrible fit of gas. What is it that you are seeking, giants? Albina asked. We are entranced by you, Runt the giant admitted. We wish for you to come to the land of the giants and live with us, the giant Og added. We wish to ask for your hands in marriage, if you will accept us, the giant Marlene said, or your presence in our community, if you will not. We wish to have your ideas and your work and your voices and your minds so that we may become more than ourselves. We wish to place crowns on your heads and flowers at your feet, if you wish, the giant Runt said, or work alongside you if you do not. We wish to build libraries and schools and lecture halls. We wish to raise pigeons and learn metallurgy and become good farmers and to study the stars. You can do all of those things without us, Albina said. Why should we come with you? Our lives are here. You are wearing someone else's clothes and using someone else's names, while your own are maligned, Og said. Here you are impostors in your own land, hidden from your own people. We wish to give you a nation, one that is yours forever. Your lives may be here, but is this really the life you would choose? Silence fell. I prefer slacks, Albina said, looking at the giant Marlene in the eye. So keep them, Marlene said. She held Albina's gaze for a moment. Then she blushed. The children exchanged glances with one another, then felt their hearts begin to sink. They looked at the king's face. He curled around himself as though his heart had been struck by an arrow. Indeed, the children thought, perhaps it actually had. King Diodysius, years after his eventual passing, was known for his tender, capacious heart, which is saying something given how many times it had been broken. His wicked daughters gone, his sons-in-law turned sons vanished in the night. No one knew where they had gone, but despite those great sorrows, his capacity to love only increased. He threw his attention to the care and rearing of his foundling children, and he knew each one by name. He saw to their education and interests and development. He cheered them in their successes and comforted them in their failures. He loved them every step of the way. And once he raised those children, he continued to open his home to more. He followed in his beloved Althea's footsteps and built school after school and university after university. He was generous to a fault, nearly bankrupting himself more than once. He dissolved the council in favor of forming a parliament of the peasantry, both in service to the people and voted into office by the people. He was loved, venerated, adored. Years later, he began entertaining emissaries from the country once called the land of the giants, but now called Albion, though the reason for the name change was lost to history. The emissaries, giants all with big vocabularies and big hearts, with pronounced chins and broad shoulders and quick feet and bright minds, all called him Grandpop. No one knew why.